So someone told me in the cafe across the road that this was set up for 3 hours. It's not 3 hours.
That's what it was saying in the Outlook, so I decided to double check just in case.
So the intent here is, I actually don't know how long the talk will be.
It could be 4 hours, could be 5.
But it's definitely not 4 hours.
You'll know when we all leave in an hour.
Yeah.
So we'll all leave in an hour. And you'll know.
Yeah, just keep on talking and talking. So, should we give it like just 5 minutes for everyone to show up, or well, how does it usually happen?
We start?
You just start?
Yep.
Okay.
So we normally do
Introductions. Dave, Mark, Karen, Lucy, Andrew. So we're going to do it like that, or?
Peek in the front, everyone. Okay, cool.
Hey everyone, this is Karen.
Yeah, so Martin is going to talk about how we built a top closing up with $30,000 and a remote team. Take it away, Martin.
Yeah, that.
And you got more applause. There we go.
So a few years back, I went on a project, and part of the reason I started doing that project was that since this was a few years back, so this was around 2014, and I guess the reason we started this project, or we seeked out the project, was that both my business partner and I, well, more me than him, had been on really big enterprise projects for a pretty long time, like since 2001. So, and one of the things with big enterprise projects, it takes really, really long for you to get sort of like value in your customers' hands. So this was an opportunity to prove to ourselves that we can actually build software. And that's what started it all. And I think the reason this talk is relevant to what we're doing here at MYB is we're a pretty big company. 65 platform delivery crews, and in some of the cases we have like up to 10 crews working on the same initiative. And that iterative development and incremental development is actually pretty hard already if you're working in a small project, let alone when you're working in a big project. And what I really wanted to do here is to share with you how we approached iterative and incremental development, to give you sort of like an idea of a case study on where we did it and some of the things that we ran into. And hopefully you'll walk out of here with some ideas on how you can apply it within your respective teams. And obviously acknowledging that, yeah, sure, we are in a bigger organization, but there are some key takeaways. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the Feature Maker stuff is to push as much of those, not empowerment, because that's not the right word, but much of that sort of like power for you to be able to make those decisions yourselves. Okay, any questions? Cool. So I sort of like put out a tweet, as you usually do when you want to get dev work, because it's that easy to get dev work. And someone replied, someone I really respect. I was living in Johannesburg at the time, and someone that I really respect living in a small little town called Stellenbosch, which is like Cape Town's Wiki, sort of like this is where all the wine is. Nice restaurants and wine. And they run a pretty sort of like well-known app company, and they sort of like said, hey, we have this project that we want to do. We've sort of like been putting it on the back burner, and you guys may be perfect for that. And the whole idea was that this company, their customer, had it's essentially a company that had these user-generated maps, and I'll get into that part a bit later. But they had these maps, that's physical maps, that if you go on safari into the middle of Africa, you have this map with you, right? And you usually have a guidebook which looks, I don't know why it's automatically skipping. You have a guidebook that looks something like this. It's got a nice photo, a bit of a description of the place that you're going to. It's got a breakdown, it keeps on doing a double skip. It's got a breakdown of like the facilities available, and maybe some more details around those respective facilities. So they really wanted to make this electronic. So the brief was, hey guys, make this electronic. And we're like, okay, cool. That is what we're going to do. We're going to put this on an app. Brilliant. Brief done, fantastic. We can now start development. So we got the job. We were happy. We're going to start development. Not a lot of money, only $30,000. And we said, well, let's get started. And then they shared some of their initial analysis that they had done. So one of the first things they shared with us was this screen flow, these mock-ups that their UX people had put together, which was obviously really informative. And then they also shared, it's doing a double skip here. They also shared like this breakdown of their user stories, like all the user stories. And some of those stories are interesting. So it's sort of like said, I want to be able to zoom, and I want to be able to switch GPS on and off, and I want to see maps that I've already bought. So they were features, right? They weren't really stories. What was even more telling was the epics were, we have project infrastructure epic, we have the map display epic, we have user location and display epic, maps, library, content and points of interest epic, right? Epics. And that should have been a warning sign for us, because these aren't epics, right? These are just modules or collection of features. And that's something that very commonly goes around in projects, is that we have an epic or a module, collection of features, and then inside there, we just put a whole bunch of features. And Dave Hussman, when he talks about story mapping, says it's very similar to me going and saying, hey, I take a bunch of leaves, I put it into a black bag, I take a bunch of twigs, I put it into a black bag, I take some bark, some dirt, some roots, and I say, here's your tree, right? And I hope you can build a swing out of this. So it doesn't really talk to the user experience that we really want. And we realized this when we came to the shocking realization that after 2 weeks of development, we actually haven't created any value. Right? We were sort of like faffing around, trying to build features. And we did a projection of our velocity. Yes, the teams should probably have an idea of your rate of delivery and your ability to deliver. So we did a projection of our velocity. And we realized that roughly, given the way we understand the problem today, we're probably going to need 10 times the amount of money to finish the story, or to finish this piece of work. This really isn't working. So we wasted essentially 2 weeks worth of development. And we realized that, hey, we need to do something about this. So luckily, I was going to Cape Town to speak at a conference about refactoring, and I saw that as an opportunity to, hey, well, when I'm there, I can quickly go and see these people. Their offices was only about 50 kilometers drive. So there was a pretty, let's do this. And I've got a puzzle to solve while I'm talking. Interview question. Can you talk and solve a puzzle at the same time? So there was an opportunity to go and see them. So we sort of like knew that we needed to understand this problem a bit better, probably pivot a little bit and then come up with some plan. So I was off to Cape Town for that conference, and I saw an opportunity to go to the winelands, which you can have nice wine, and I could go and speak to these people about their problem. So I drove there, and so like we sat in this big open plan office with the guy that owns the company, of this mapping company, and our client, who was the sort of like intermediate. And we started having a conversation about the product. And I sort of like said, well, you know, this reminds me a bit of story mapping. You know, the story mapping is that whole idea where you actually go and create a story and you come up with the features that you want to build. That's a user story. It's a story of how the user uses the system, not a feature. And he sort of like explained to us that what usually happens is they get into a car, the people that work for him, and they drive somewhere into the middle of nowhere. And as they're driving, they may open up the map and they would start looking up different things. I need water, or I need fuel, or I need a place to sleep. And remember, this is the middle of Africa, there's absolutely nothing. It's like the outback, there's just like nothing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And he was sort of like explained us this sort of like experience that people would go through and how they would use the map and how they would use the guidebook. And that started helping us understand this whole thing. What he also explained to us was that in the 90s, this is roughly what it looked like, right? So people had these really, really expensive GPSs that they bought from Garmin. They mounted some, well, this is an exceptional case, probably a bit of a geek. The keyboard might give it away. Mark is obviously very happy that he sees a cool keyboard. It's not ergonomic, but we'll get into that. And they would actually record where they're driving with the GPS, and that recorded data they would feed back to the company. And then I started understanding his vision. Like, what he basically wants to do is he wants to first digitize these sort of like maps, and then start replacing these very sophisticated GPS devices that they were using in the 90s. Interesting little factoid is that he, I can't remember his name, like for the life of me, I was like, I think it was John. So let's call him John. John had taken the idea to Google, and he said, hey Google, brilliant idea. He was working with another US company which were doing user-generated map content. That company sold to Google using all of his IP, and he never had the right contacts in place. So part of this was he wanted to have his swan song, right? So he actually wanted to build this product up, which is interesting. I think they sold for like $100 million. And that reminded me of an experience that I had where we went into the middle of Africa in like a safari. I've only done it once. It's not something you do every day or on the way to work, for that matter. And you know, the areas are pretty desolate, right? You drive for 6-7 hours with basically just seeing this. Occasionally, you see this. So having that context with you, with that map, and being able to pinpoint where you are on the map and where you're going to get fuel and water next actually becomes pretty important. So I could empathize with the problem a lot better as well, because he had given us a lot more color to this story, right? And then you can end up seeing little animals like that. So the other thing that we really wanted to do was that we wanted to continuously deliver valuable software to them, because we recognized that we're not ever going to build everything that they want, right? You know, this user-generated map content, it's pretty advanced stuff. Building it on multiple platforms, pretty advanced stuff. So we said from day one, whatever we build, we want to have working software within our customers' hands, right? And this is an iOS app, and which is essentially a desktop application. It's a modern desktop application, right? Distribution is the same distributions you have with desktop, you have with iOS. So we did continuous delivery with iOS, which is an important point for you to consider. What's also quite interesting is we had 4 cities with 9 people, and we were fully remote. The reason it worked was the last point. We were fully remote. Even if we were a block away from each other, we would not sit in the same room, out of principle, because the moment we said that, we would have conversations with each other, and we would exclude everyone that was online. Just like one little interesting side note about this. This happened to be, as a developer, one of the most productive teams I've ever been in, because we just managed this right. So I've seen teams that were partially remote before, and that actually doesn't really work. Okay. And the other thing that was really important for us is that we realized that the first thing that we need to do is we need to release. For us to do continuous delivery, the first step for continuous delivery is to release. Right? That sounds weird. So set up our build server, set up our deployment processes, set up all of those things, set up the distribution to alpha users was our first and utmost priority. Once we had that in place, we could then start iterating pretty quickly. So that was our first item on our backlog. And then we started iterating. The first thing that we did was we literally took PDF versions of the map that were scale-sized, and we plotted them out onto OpenStreetMap. So remember, user generated, and one of the things that the team at the company at Tracks for Africa needed to do was they needed to take the mapping data out of their GIS system, and they needed to feed it into OpenStreetMaps so that they could generate maps that we could process while we were figuring out all of this technology. So they just gave us a PDF and said, here's the PDF, this is good enough, and we'll work from there. Right? So that was the first version that we've put into our customers' app. Okay, we didn't make this available to beta users yet, or alpha users yet. We'll get to the alpha point a bit later. The next thing is, well, we realized we needed to map out these points of interest on a map. So we got the real points of interest on a map. We also realized, you'll see there, there's a bar at the bottom. We realized we needed to switch different categories on and off. That was pretty important. So we built that and released that. These are screenshots, these are screenshots that we were sort of like discussing in our weekly sort of like planning sessions, right? We will make that available. What was interesting is at this point, you may see that the map started changing. No, sorry, it comes a bit later. What was interesting at this point, the customer actually said, hey, I actually think you understand this problem better than us. You have full control in prioritizing the backlog. So if you're doing iterative development well, and your customer turns around, a very good sign that you're doing it well is your customer turns around to you and say, for year for us, UX and product management, turns around to us as the development teams and say, okay, I trust you to do the prioritization. It's a very good asset test that you actually have connectedness to the problem. And roughly around this time, they actually told us, hey, we just trust you. Just show us what you've built. Just keep on doing the showcases. And if you have questions, come and chat with us. So we went along, we made the pins a little bit smaller if you compare. We added the filters at the bottom. We had a really, really ugly sort of like compass. Compass only got fixed much later on. So as we went along, we introduced sort of like search capabilities and ability to just say what we're seeing in these areas. At this point, we had actually replaced the physical map already. Very, very sort of like flaky product in a way, because you can't navigate it as easily. But like the search was there, we didn't have a list of search results, but we would see it on the screen. So at this point, we had to replace the map. Pretty cool. We introduced search results. You may see that we had a cool idea. I wrote some C code to calculate the Mercator distance, like who was geeking out doing that. It was more of a geek out than anything else. We ended up throwing it away because no one cares how the crow flies. You know, you actually want to go on the roads. But anyways, still fun. And we got this listing out. And by this time, we had replaced the table of contents in the guidebook, right? Because now we found the stuff, we can just page to the area and we know what we're looking for. Or at least we're amplifying the table of contents and projecting it onto this. And then we started replacing the actual guidebook content. We moved around a few things. We started adding linking into the products. One of the interesting things that we also did here was around this time, we had integrated the website. So if they on the website on the phone click a link, they would open the right stuff. So you can actually start sharing links. So if you're planning a trip with a friend who's also got the app, you can share the links with them. Or they don't need to have the app, they just use the website. Which was a pretty nifty addition that we had done here. I didn't really know where to put the slides, I just put it here. So just before we went to alpha, we realized something. We realized we were actually not having any retrospectives. Who thinks that's a bad thing? Show of hands. 2, 3, 4, anyone else? 5. So about 5 people thinks it's a bad thing to run retrospectives. What was interesting was that when we ran... What?
Not to have retrospectives is what you are.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I tripped myself up. Bad thing to not have retrospectives. Show of hands. Who thinks it's bad to not have retros?
No, I'm questioning it.
Okay. So, one more ad. So what was interesting was double negatives always trip you up. But anyways, what was interesting was we got to a point where we were like, hey, why are we not doing retrospectives? And the interesting reflection was that we were continuously reflecting and improving, right? It was just happening. We had a meeting, we would reflect back on the meeting and we would improve. We had a deployment, we would reflect back on the deployment and we would improve. We would move a ticket, we would look back and improve. And we said, hey, well, maybe we should run a retro. We used Google Drawings, worked really well. I think I've done it with two of the teams here. And we realized that there were a few things to improve, but nothing really, because we were already looking at them. It was just more sort of like confirming a lot of the improvements that we were making along the process. So that was interesting. We did do one or two more of these. It was more at the pivotal milestones of our release, and it was typically more to look at specific issues, especially interpersonal issues that we picked up. So there is benefit in running retrospectives. For me, the ultimate step is that you're continuously trying to close those feedback loops. But it was also interesting. This was my working environment. It's the only photo I have. So then we got ready for alpha, and the first version that we put out in alpha was something like this. So it was essentially a feature-complete version of the product. But there was a problem with this. There was a pretty big problem. If you had a search that was tightly clustered, you would have a whole bunch of points on each other, and it made the app unusable. And it was also pretty hard that even if they were basically thumb distance apart from each other, you couldn't tap on those things. And there was also a minimal zoom. go into a heavily populated area, the app wasn't really usable. And we recognized, I think the piece of work was about 21 story points. Overall scope was about 100 story points. That suddenly we couldn't do these small incremental improvements anymore. And we needed to figure this wickedly hard problem out. So we needed to figure out some clustering algorithm, but we still wanted to have incremental improvement. So how did we approach it? How would you have approached that? Crickets. You should have a cricket sound. So the first thing is we just implemented the default clustering algorithm that ships with the OpenStreetMap stuff. It's not very intuitive. Just all it does is it scans a grid, and if there's more than one item, it just puts them together. And we just sort of like felt this actually fixes the problem, but it's not really good enough. So we looked at that algorithm, we did some research on some algorithms, and we figured out roughly what this algorithm would need to do. And all we basically went and did was go and code that, and we essentially came up with something like this, and that was the next release. So what we did to break this up was we built a very lightweight version, potentially wrong version of the clustering algorithm. And then we designed our own one based on some science that we could find. There's not a lot written about it. And we came up with something that was reasonably good. And this is what we then essentially made available to the alpha users. And then we refined that even further. What's also important here is I see, for some reason I removed the photo last night, but you can tap on that and it will show a list here. And that showing of a list is something that was a separate release as well. So we just tried to break that problem up into smaller ones. And in some of those cases, it wasn't actually massively beneficial to the customer to have those, because the problem just persisted in a different way. But they could start seeing how the thing would progress. So they would still need to zoom in for those things to space out, because they couldn't tap on it yet. Does that sort of like make sense? Interestingly, this was the place in the project where test-driven development really helped us. We hadn't really done test-driven development up until now. And the reason was, well, maybe for the search and all of the logic in the background to do the distance calculations and the searches and this stuff, but the rest of the stuff is all UI driven. And TDD actually killed us. We once or twice went into it and we would lose 2 or 3 weeks trying to get it to work, because the automated UI testing on iOS just doesn't exist. So it was interesting. It was an interesting learning that every time we would try to get automated UI tests working here, we would just lose time, so we gave up on that. So then we got to done. So we had essentially, after about 6 months of development, have solved the majority of the problems within the customer had on that prime user story. And we had the first user story done. So you could get into your car, you can drive into Africa, and you can go and have a safari, and you don't need the physical map and the physical guidebook with you anymore, right? Done. So that user journey, story journey, just a different name, that user journey was implemented. And we had done numerous iterations of that as we had gone forward, and it was something that was in people's hands. We also built a iPhone 5 app, or iPhone app after we went live, because we recognized that it is for us to do small iterations. It would better be for us to think about that problem later, even though it was way more expensive for us to build the iPhone app after the fact, because we essentially had to rebuild the entire UI. It was better for the customer because they went live and they started making about $5,000 a month while we were building. So that the app itself started funding the iPhone development, even though the iPhone development was more expensive, which was pretty interesting as well. There was something else I wanted to mention here. I forgot to mention this. So at some stage, obviously, the maps became available, and we were fine-tuning how that was working. And you see, this is pretty with relief and stuff like that, but we couldn't go live with that because it ended up being a 3 gig download. So we launched top grossing app in the first week. I spoke to the guys that's still maintaining it today. It's currently grossing around $5,000 a week. One of the other interesting takeaways is that it was also a featured app in the African app stores. And one of the interesting key takeaways as well was they built an Android app. The Android app was a hybrid app based on, I think, Cronje. It bombed completely. I think they're making about $100 a week on it. So they will never recover the money that they spent on it. And it's just because as an interesting tidbit, that like hybrid apps are good for some things and it's really, really bad for some other things. So that was a pretty expensive lesson for them as a company. What else was interesting? There was something else I should have mentioned. No, there wasn't. So we went live. That's roughly what the final version of that app looks like. And I guess I just wanted to share with you what really worked on this project that I feel was some of the key sort of like success criteria here. So the first thing that worked was that everyone just played their role. It wasn't like Peter and I would have a conversation and say, hey, Peter, you're a BA and I'm a QA and this is where BA starts and this is where QA ends and that type of conversation. It's like, Peter, you're good with this stuff, I'm good with this stuff, and we just showed up and we did that, right? So there was a designer, there was actually a UX person on the project, but it turned out that he was more of a designer, and we supported him in doing the user experience thing, and we all did the user experience stuff together. We had a person that was sort of like the agile coach on this, and at the end of the day, she was busy with other really, really critical projects, and she just helped us facilitate one or two sort of like key conversations, and we carried that responsibility on all of us. So for me, that was probably the most remarkable thing about that team, is that people just played their role, right? They just showed up and they did the job. The other thing that was cool was there was implicit continuous improvement. So the conversation just happened the whole time. And that it was trunk-based development. So with here and there, we had branching. The two places where we had branches was when we did the clustering algorithm, because the development was more than a few days. And the other place we had a branch was when we did the in-app purchases. Because in-app purchases is insanely hard to test. And it's actually, you can corrupt the environment as if it's poorly implemented. So we didn't want to push that stuff to our users on a daily basis. Not even behind a feature switch. The other thing, that's tell people about it. We told people that we knew and trusted, hey, there's the beta switch, and they would sign up, and we would just send out an email to them. They flick the beta, and you would get early access. And we would do A/B testing with them on features. And then the early access was every day you would get an email of the latest build, and you would get a breakdown of the stories or the commit logs essentially. And it's good enough. It was really hard for the users to understand those commit logs sometimes, but it was good enough. What was also really interesting was relentless refactoring. When we did the iOS, the iPhone implementation of the app, we were pretty serious about doing continuous refactoring the whole time and maintaining a backlog of the big refactors that we needed to do. So with that, what continuous refactoring means is every time you touch the code, you need to leave it better than what you found it, right? And we were very conscious about the places where we would get into a rabbit hole. The moment we realized we were getting into a rabbit hole, we would revert to commit and we would restart implementing the feature. In fact, for most of the features that we built, we would do a quick implementation of the feature to see how it works. We would trash that and we would do a proper implementation. And the other thing, and what that sort of like taught me was that the code that you write, you should never feel attached to, right? You should feel attached to the solution that's in your head about the code. That's the thing that really, really matters. And we actually got into a habit that if we came to work the next day and there was a pending commit, we would just chuck it. Because it's more time trying to figure out what we were thinking yesterday than it was just to try and continue coding where we left off. And that all contributed to the relentless refactoring. The one thing was that there was a place where we say, hey, we need to refactor. We didn't. And that actually came back and bit us when we did the iOS implementation. And it was much harder to fix that. So even like being prudent, sometimes it does still come back and bites you. For us, the hardest thing about doing handover was we were so proud of how pristine the code was that we gave it to the developers and we were like checking the commit logs on a daily basis for a month afterwards just to make sure that the code is still pristinely clean. And you couldn't see who wrote what in the code either, which was pretty cool as well. And that talks about the conscious design trade-off and that the grooming and slicing was happening continuously as well. So we would, we had a backlog, it was on Jira because we were remote. And our backlog was prioritized the whole time. And we would essentially go to we worked in sprints because sprints just helped us plan, like plan retrospectives and plan our planning sessions. And when we would do demos, so it would just like every 2 weeks we would do a demo to the customer where we discuss the priorities. But the conversation was more, here's what we built. It's not the first time he saw it. Here's what we built. This is what we think the priorities would be, and he would sort of like, yeah, sure. And we would ask him a bunch of questions about the product, and we would end. That's usually a good conversation with the product owner. And I guess the key lesson for us at the end was truly understand your customer, right? So really understand how they use it, and really build up that empathy with them. Reflecting back on this, I think, and just bringing it all together, that iterative development isn't that bag of stories that you sort of like prioritize and you sort of like put it forward and you say, this is the benefit that we're going to get. The iterative development is actually building workable versions of the software that has benefit that people can use with every single day that passes, every single week that passes. That's iterative development. And a benefit there is at any time you can actually stop the project and people have something that's beneficial and worthwhile for them. So when we run out of budget or when we pivot, we still have something that's done and we don't throw stuff away. Right? That's absolutely key. Cool. And Cape Town. All right, any questions?
Is there anything you would have done differently?
Is there anything we would have done differently? Yeah, I think we wouldn't have wasted 2 weeks at the beginning 2 weeks was a pretty significant chunk. There were one or two interpersonal problems that was pretty hard to manage remotely. I think just looking back on them, we would have tried harder to make sure that those relationships were well maintained. And we probably, like, we sort of like Cucumber with, what was it? I can't remember the framework's name now. It's a UI framework for Cucumber, for Gherkin-based framework for iOS. We should have canned it on attempt one. We tried twice, and we lost a lot of time with it.
And it was an iOS app to begin with, and then it was an iPhone app?
iPad and then iPhone, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Was the end goal to make it an iPhone app, or it was always meant to be an iPad app to begin with?
The fundamental goal was to make it an iPad app. Keep in mind it's on their dashboard as they go into the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
I have the iPhone app here on my phone, and the iPhone app is more of a convenience thing. You're walking around and you want to check something quick. So the main use case was around tablets. We ended up building the iPhone app with like $5,000, so it wasn't massive.
So how did you work remotely, the 9 of you, like on stories? Were you like working on an individual, you all working on the same story at the same time and constantly collaborating together? Or?
We would sometimes get together to pair, but the collaboration was more in the constant communication we were having.
So you'd be working on individual stories but constantly feeding back?
Sometimes individual acceptance criteria, yeah. So, like, a day when I was working with a designer, we took something like, hey, implement this, run this, take a screenshot, send it back to him, talk about it, he does this. So we would be sending things back and forth. We would be working on the same thing, but it would be sort of like experimenting. And then I would try to do stuff with sort of like drawing it out in code, and he would be doing stuff and drawing it out in PNGs, and we would try and figure out how to make it work, playing with buttons and stuff like that. So yeah, in terms of development, there was a pretty clear delineation of, we could do a pretty clear delineation of responsibilities. So the in-app purchases versus the actual mapping application has a pretty clear separation to maintain. But it is hard to share online.
3 questions. First
Sure.
question, was the code clean after handover, after the first month?
I have the code here. I haven't looked at the code since. It's now 2 years later. We were proud of the code that we had handed over. Yeah.
Second question, the online tools that you used, there was Google Drawings you used. Was there anything else that you used?
Slack. It was the first project I used Slack. What was interesting with comms was that, and for me that was the biggest shocker coming to MIB, because we have one video conferencing tool. Like there it was, we would start with Hangouts. If Hangouts doesn't work, people would already be waiting in Skype. Right? So the moment one person has an audio problem, we would just all exit the call, we would go to another tool. We wouldn't spend an iota of time trying to fix the tool. If Hangouts didn't work, we would try a peer.in. If Skype didn't work, we would try a peer.in. If that, we would try GSM. If that didn't work, we would either can the meeting or some of the people would get together in meet space. So that was pretty sort of like relentless. We just abandon it, go to the next tool. Worked really, really well. We used Jira. It actually worked really well. We used, actually it worked really well. That actually is pretty important because it usually doesn't. And we used Atlassian source control.
Cool. And then how did you choose the 9 people? Did you know them? Did you seeing that they were all...
It was just the team that was available. It wasn't like a 1,000-person company.
Okay.
It's not a. There's no opportunity for self-selection if there is only those people available.
No. Because did you build the team up from scratch? So that was the team at the point
Part
in
of the
time.
team was our company, and another part of the team was the company that we were working with. So the tester, the coach, and the UX was part of the company, and development was us.
Okay.
What did the 30K cover? Salaries and everything? Sounds the 30,000 for your budget?
That's a good question. So the 30K was what our company had spent, or what we. So there was a majority of us was. No, actually it wasn't. But 22K was our company, and about 8K was the company that we were working with. So no one there was working full time, and we weren't working full time either. In fact, I was earning half my rate working on this than the money I was making from coaching. So I was coaching teams at the time, and I was doing that 2 to 3 days a week, and this 2 to 3 days a week. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So, like, we didn't try to carry our company on the project, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I was just wondering how the budget worked.
Yeah.
It sounded like, very much for that amount of people.
Not really. Yeah. So a lot of the people that were non-developers were all full part-time. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
What were the ways where you managed to get feedback from your alpha or beta users? What did that look like?
I remember the guy's name now. Johan was his name, and he actually had a very trusted base of people that used that. What was interesting, I prepped for this question, but it was that's why I remember his name. So what was interesting is everyone that worked at his company were users of their products. Like one guy had one of those BMW touring bikes. The guy that was doing all the map data had like one of those BMW touring bikes. The lady that was helping us with the geospatial data she and her husband would go into the middle of Africa. So they were the initial alpha users, and then he had close friends and sort of like people that used it as well. They essentially got the software for free. Those people that have this funny setup were our early access people. Yeah.
And was it just through emails or phone calls?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. We just got feedback.
Cool.
Yeah. We didn't need to speak to them. Like they were doing a good job in representing them for us. Yeah. I don't think any of us ever spoke to any of the end customers except the people that were using the product, that owned the product. Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, thank you. If you have any further questions, if you want to see a demo of the app, by all means, you're welcome to. We can have a look at the code together. Hopefully it's still clean. Bastards. Cool.